Chapter Spooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapter Spooks, the show where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. And today we have a bit of an odd story for you. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the title, because it's called Frankenturkey. That's a fun name, no notes. I'm not going to complain that it's a silly name, because that's half the fun of these stories. But I was thinking about the fact that it uses these titles from the public domain in classic literature, and this is quite common. It's a common enough trope, so often it will reference things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Romeo and Juliet. Dracula is even mentioned in a few. So on the one hand, it is an awful lot of fun. After all, it fulfills my personal philosophy when it comes to what makes a good Chapter Spooks book, and that is quite simply, it takes horror and offers it with a slice of cheese. So it makes a scary idea slightly more digestible by adding that cheesy, silly, kid-friendly element. Because these are kids' books, after all. Don't get me wrong, kids like being scared, but they don't like being horrified. I mean, we don't want to get into things like death, pain, torture, man's inhumanity to man, disgust, gore. Like, these are getting a little bit too extreme for the little ones. And what better way to take horror and add that slice of cheese than to take something like a serious work of classical horror, like Frankenstein or Dracula, and then make it kid-friendly, add that silly element like Frankenturkey instead of Frankenstein. However, I am in two minds about this, because it's very common in Chapter Spooks books at least, that they tend to reference the original story in the title, maybe with a single character, but they don't take any of the plot elements, which, as I said, I'm in two minds about it, because it was very common for kids' horror in the 1980s and earlier to do this kind of thing. After all, when comic books were the main source of horror for kids, especially in EC comics, I know I read some of Vault of Horror and Tales from the Crypt, and they often would take public domain urban legends and stories and classic horror, and they would rewrite it in a way that was slightly different and easier to display in a comic book format. I wouldn't necessarily say that they were more kid-friendly. They definitely were more approachable, although EC horror tended to aim for a slightly older crowd than the middle grade crowd, which I think most Chapter Spooks books are aiming for. But my point is, there is a precedence for rewriting these stories for kids, and I think some of my favourite works of classic horror, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Monkey's Paw, The Colour Out of Space, The Telltale Heart, The Yellow Wallpaper, all of these stories, they are fantastic, but I also think that they sometimes delve into a little bit too much of that horror for kids. It's not so much scary as horrifying. And I think it would be great to rewrite those for kids, but as a writer myself, I do understand that people want to make their own stories rather than just rewrite the classics, and arguably that does make a lot more sense than just rehashing. After all, these stories do still exist, and maybe they're meant for an older audience than middle grade kids, but I still think it would be an interesting challenge. After all, something like the effort it would take to turn a story like The Telltale Heart or The Yellow Wallpaper into something that's not only modern but child-friendly, that would have to be unique. It would be so different from the original that it would be its own thing. And hey, not every single story of a Chapter Spook book is entirely unique. They often do reuse similar story trends, similar things from like urban legends. I guess my issue is that I would find it more enjoyable if the stories they were retelling were some of the greatest stories that there are, as opposed to retelling the same story that, hey, if you just listened to the warnings your parents told you, everything would have been fine. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. Thankfully, this story is a pretty concise one, but let's waste no more time and dive straight into Bone Chillers number 4, Frankenturkey. We are introduced to our main character, Kyle Duggan. He and his sister Annie have left for school early in the hopes that they'll manage to avoid Jake Wilbanks, who is the school bully. He's a really big kid because he was kept back a grade, and so he is bigger and stronger than the other kids, and because Kyle and Annie are new to this school, they just moved to Massachusetts from Florida. And since Jake likes beating up the new kid, he has been catching him before the bus every morning and taking his lunch money. But today he really twists the knife because he forces Kyle to say, "I'm a wimp, I'm a wimp, I'm a wimp," 10 times just to really show who's in charge. Then when he gets to school, we learn two things. Firstly, his mother is the 6th grade teacher, part of the reason why they moved to Massachusetts, but of course Kyle finds it embarrassing. And secondly, his mother declares that they are going to be celebrating Thanksgiving Eve by having everyone dress up as pilgrims and Indians. Most of the kids want to dress up like Indians, but of course Kyle knows that he's going to be dressed up as a pilgrim because his mum's the teacher and he's got to take the short end of the stick. As far as I'm concerned, whether you're dressing up like a racist caricature or dressing up like a colonizer, it's weird to dress up as a culture that's not yours. Then again, we don't have Thanksgiving in Australia, and I don't really get it. Maybe that's the point. When Kyle gets home after school that day, he's kind of in a grumpy mood because, well, to be frank, his life sucks. But his parents decide, well, the reason why you're so upset is because, yeah, we're in Massachusetts, it's different from Florida. We need to start some new traditions. So how about we'll, instead of getting like canned pumpkin and stuff and getting turkey from the deli, how about we get a proper turkey? We'll go buy a turkey, raise it ourselves, and then we'll slaughter it and eat it on Thanksgiving Day. And we'll dress up like pilgrims the whole time because we've got to bring that weirdness into it too. Kyle's not overly enthusiastic because, well, why would he be? But when they do go to get the turkey, they purchase it from the turkey place, and he gets one of the turkeys that are in the back that's sort of standing on its own because he thinks it looks just as lonely as him, and he finds a kindred spirit in the turkey. I have to add though, the guy selling the turkeys is kind of a dick. They notice there are pennies on the ground, and he says it's because you have to put pennies on the ground to make sure that turkeys actually eat because they're too stupid to eat, which, for the record, is not true. I've heard that when you've got young poults, then you might have to teach them to start eating by putting something shiny in their food. But fully grown turkeys aren't that stupid. In fact, he says they're the stupidest creatures on the earth, but they have a pecking order, they have a social hierarchy, they understand one another, they're social creatures, so his claim that they're the stupidest bird on earth is actually quite offensive. In fact, he says, "Turkeys are so stupid, I'm surprised they were smart enough to walk onto Noah's Ark." And it's clear to me that the irony of that statement is completely lost on him. Anyhow, they take the turkey home, they make up his pen for him. There's an old chicken pen, which they get some chicken wire and set it up for him. And the parents explain that they're going to have to feed and water the turkey, take good care of him. But they also say, now, no matter what you do, don't go naming this turkey. We don't want you to get attached because it is going to be Thanksgiving dinner. And we don't want you to be upset about that. Despite this, when they're setting up the pen and Kyle is getting to know the turkey, realizing that's actually quite smart. He eats without needing pennies on the ground because, again, that's stupid and not true. But also, it seems to enjoy getting cuddles from them. It seems to be really attached to them. And so he decides to call the turkey gobbledygook after the gobbling sound it makes all the time. Oh, I forgot to add that apparently Mrs. Duggan decided when they bought the turkey that as part of their Thanksgiving Eve celebrations, they're going to bring the turkey to school. You know what? It doesn't make any sense. We'll talk about it after the summary. So when Kyle goes to school the next day, he's confronted by Jake after Mrs. Duggan says, "Oh, we're going to bring a turkey to school." And Jake, for some reason, doesn't seem to believe that he has a turkey. But when he insists, "Yeah, we've got a turkey," he threatens to wring its neck, I guess just because he's being a bully. And this makes Kyle very scared for this turkey. I'm not kidding, he actually seems to think that if he's not careful, then Jake might sneak out of school, go to their house, and kill their turkey at their house while he's still at school. It's a little bit contrived, especially considering that we already know the turkey's in danger. They're going to kill it for Thanksgiving dinner. But what matters is that when he and his sister get home after school that day, he and her talk about how they've started to get attached to gobbledygook. In fact, even their dog, a chubby golden retriever called Trouble, even he's grown attached to gobbledygook. They're like friends. So they don't want this turkey to die, and they don't want it to be killed by Jake. So this is when Kyle comes up with a plan. He decides that they should make some kind of a fake turkey to put in the pen. That way, if Jake ever comes near, he'll see the turkey, but if he wants to go and hurt it, well, it's not the real turkey, so gobbledygook will be safe. In order to make this fake gobbledygook turkey thing, they go to the supermarket and they buy a turkey and they have to paint it up. It's kind of weird. I'll just read an excerpt from the book. So this is how it happens in the book. He and Annie ducked inside and headed straight for the frozen food department. Kyle picked out a small turkey that was close to the size of gobbledygook. "What are you going to do with that?" Annie asked doubtfully as they pooled their money and paid for the bird. "You'll see," Kyle said again. "Come on, we've got to get home before it storms." Trouble was sniffing wildly at the package as Kyle put it into the basket on his bike. The kids jumped into their bikes and pedaled for home. Before they were halfway there, raindrops the size of quarters started splattering on the road and on their clothes. By now, the dark clouds had blocked out most of the sunlight, and the wooded road was gloomy and dark. When they finally reached their driveway, Kyle grabbed the turkey out of the basket and dropped his bike onto the grass. "Get a bunch of coat hangers and your bed pillow and meet me in the garage," he told Annie breathlessly. "And hurry!" He dashed into the garage and laid the frozen turkey on a small table under the window. Looking outside, he frowned at the sky. Those big fat raindrops were still falling lazily. But judging by the darkening storm clouds, Kyle had a feeling the weather was going to get a lot worse. And soon. It was hard to see what he was doing in the gloomy garage. He went to his father's workbench and found a flashlight. He turned it on and sat it on a wooden beam so it shone down on the turkey carcass. Next he pulled the rubber monster mask that he had worn on Halloween out of his jacket pocket. It was blood red and had a huge orange beak covered with grungy-looking warts. "It may not look much like gobbledygook, but it's the best I can do," he thought as he stuffed the mask with wadded-up newspaper. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a split second. Just then, Annie ran into the garage, followed by Trouble. She let out a shriek at the sight of the mask. The coat hanger she was carrying clattered to the floor. "What's that?" she demanded. "Take it easy," he said. "It won't hurt you. It's our bogus bird. Come here and help me put it together." Annie eyed him nervously for a moment, then murmured, "Okay." Together they set to work in the circle of light from the flashlight. An occasional flash of lightning lit up the whole garage, making the flashlight's beam seem weak and dim by comparison. Kyle carefully connected the Halloween mask to the frozen bird with the wire coat hangers. Annie slid open the pillow and glued the feathers to the bird. Next the kids found a can of brown paint and 2 brushes in their father's workbench and painted the feathers the same dark brown color as gobbledygook. "He looks pretty good if you ask me," said Kyle, standing back to admire their handiwork. "He looks weird to me," mumbled Annie. She glanced nervously out the window as a jagged streak of lightning lit up the sky directly above the house. A rumble of thunder followed immediately, sounding like a passing freight train. Suddenly the wind began to howl. Kyle shot a quick glance out the window at the black clouds boiling in the sky. "I don't think we can get it into the house before it hits," he commented. "Why not?" asked Annie. "It still isn't raining very hard yet." Kyle shook his head. "I know, but the thunder and lightning are coming right on top of each other now," he said. "That means the storm is right above us. It's not safe outside right now. We could get struck by lightning." At that same instant, a huge clap of thunder rocked the garage. Lightning jackhammered across the sky, closer than ever. Trouble tucked his tail between his legs and dived under the table. Kyle and Annie stared out the window as rain began to pour down in torrents. It splattered against the window, sounding like rocks pounding against the roof. Suddenly, the sky lit up like daylight as a bolt of lightning crashed through the window and hit the turkey. They jumped back and Annie screamed. The electric current danced along the wire coat hangers and made the bird glow. It popped and cracked and lit up the room like a fireworks display. The rubber head bobbed up and down and the frozen body twitched. Annie and Kyle closed their eyes and clung to each other in terror. The stench of burning feathers filled their noses. As quickly as it had come, the storm was over. The lightning bolt retreated as if it had been sucked back out the window. The wind died down. The rain slowed to a gentle shower. Taking a deep breath, Kyle opened his eyes and peered around. "Oh no," he cried. Annie's eyes flew open and she let out another scream. The fake turkey was no longer the frozen corpse of a bird laid out on their father's work table. The Halloween mask was no longer lifeless rubber with painted eyes that had been connected to the body with coat hangers. The bogus turkey was alive, and it was struggling to get up. So, I'm just going to say the words magic lightning bolt and move on. Now, this new turkey that they've made apparently looks exactly like gobbledygook, except instead of having his normal-looking eyes, it has glowing red eyes. But otherwise, it is a perfect match, so they put the new turkey into the pen where gobbledygook used to be, and they put gobbledygook in the cellar. Both Kyle and Annie are kind of shocked about what just happened. After all, a dead bird, some wires, a rubber mask, and some painted feathers just came to life. But, thinking about it, Kyle realizes that it reminds him of the story of Frankenstein. After all, it's about something that gets struck by lightning and comes to life. At least that is what happens to Frankenstein in the movie, not the book. In the book, it has nothing really to do with lightning. But as I was saying at the very beginning, a lot of kids haven't read the original book, so I'll forgive him for preferring the movie in this case. That's when Mr. and Mrs. Duggan then come home, and the kids decide not to tell them what happened. I mean, I didn't think they would anyway, because the whole point was to try to trick them with a fake bird. But even if they did want to tell them, what they did was literally unbelievable, so fair enough. Then, as the chapter is ending, they hear a knock at the door, and Kyle imagines that it could be a Frankenstein monster behind the door, and he calls to his parents, "Don't open the door!" And they open the door, and it's just a normal person. As far as contrived chapter cliffhangers go, that certainly was one of them. As it turns out, this person is Jake. See, he really did want to see this turkey for some reason, and he also apparently knows where Kyle lives. Let's not question it. What matters is that he insists on seeing the turkey, and he pretends to be Kyle's friend, and so Kyle then leads him out to see Frankenturkey, because that's what's now in the pen. And then, for reasons that I can only guess are because bullies got a bully, Jake then decides to grab Frankenturkey by the neck and threaten Kyle that he's going to snap its neck. But then, of course, Frankenturkey, because it's having its neck choked, freaks out and attacks Jake, scratching at it with his claws, making him piss his pants terrified and run home. In the next chapter, Kyle and Annie are talking about what happened and saying that they need to be careful with this Frankenturkey because he's obviously dangerous, to which I would argue, I'm pretty sure any turkey you grab by the neck is going to fight for its life and try to scratch your eyes out, but maybe that's just me. Although, when Jake does try to bully Kyle at school the next day, Kyle basically threatens that he'll sick Frankenturkey on him again, and that shuts him up. So then Kyle and Anne get into a kind of a routine. Basically, they come home after school, they secretly give food and water to Gobbledygook in the cellar, and then they'll do as the parents expected, give food and water to the turkey that's in the pen, Frankenturkey. But they notice two things. First of all, Frankenturkey is getting a lot bigger than Gobbledygook. Even though they're giving them the same amount of food, he's getting very big. And secondly, they see that he's starting to derealize. He's starting to show signs of having warts on his face and a rubber mask and bits of wire sticking out of his neck, and he's starting to get a smell like burnt feathers, which somehow neither of their parents notice. But what does matter is that after a while, it's been a while, it's getting closer to Thanksgiving, Kyle offers to get the axe for him, but his dad insists that it's still pretty dangerous even if it's not sharp, so he doesn't want his son touching it. So Kyle and Annie talk about it after dinner that night, and they decide that the only solution is to get Gobbledygook out of the house. So Annie decides that they should try to find a place in the woods to hide him. So he and Annie sneak into the woods, and they end up finding a fantastic little cave. It's more like an overhanging rock, because they say it's wider than it is deep. It's just like a little hollow in a cliffside. So they put up some chicken wire, and they get Trouble's lead, they put it around Gobbledygook's neck, and they lead him out of the house to safety into this little cave. But now there's a much bigger problem. Their dog Trouble is missing, and they see that the pen where they were keeping Frankenturkey has a huge hole in the chicken wire where it's clearly burst through because this thing has gotten enormous. After some searching, they find that Trouble is hiding under the barn. In fact, he's been hacked up and scratched by Frankenturkey. He's got clumps of fur missing, he's bleeding on his nose, he's been attacked by this bird. Kyle and Anne decide that they need to hide this from their parents. So they treat him as best they can, clean some of the blood off his nose. And Anne actually gets one of her little pink shirts and puts it on him to hide the clumps of fur that have been torn off him. But once they've done that, it turns out that Frankenturkey has actually returned to its pen. And this is when Kyle, for some reason, decides that because they didn't know where Frankenturkey was in the intervening time while they were taking care of Trouble, maybe he went and attacked Gobbledygook? This kid's paranoia. I mean, he thought that as soon as Jake heard about the turkey, he thought he'd go to his house and then try to strangle it. He hears a knock on the door and thinks it's some kind of Frankenstein monster, and now he loses sight of a weird bird for a little while and assumes that it's gone to attack the turkey that they hid in the wood. I don't understand how this kid thinks. So he and his sister sneak into the woods to check on Gobbledygook, and it turns out he's fine because of course he is. Next chapter, move on. It's now the eve of Thanksgiving, which means that they need to take the turkey to school for some reason. But when they go to the pen and see Frankenturkey, Kyle and Anne look at this monstrous thing. Its head now looks like rubber once more, but it's still full of that monstrous life. It smells like burning feathers. They can see the pulsing, weird twisted coat hanger wires holding it together. So they decide, yeah, no, we're going to take Gobbledygook to school instead. So they run to the forest, they get Gobbledygook, they run him back to the car. But as they hop into the car with Gobbledygook to take him to school, they see that Frankenturkey has burst out of his pen and he's chasing after them down the road. They outrun him, of course, because, he's a turkey and they're in a car. But when they get to school, Kyle and everyone has to dress up like pilgrims and Indians, which is weird, but he then has to take Gobbledygook around and basically let the other kids pet him. But the whole time, Frankenturkey is like staring evilly at him through the windows. Oh, and for some reason, having a turkey at school means that Kyle gets some friends. Yeah, sure, why not? So Kyle and Anne then get home with Gobbledygook, and they decide they need to take him back to his cave. After all, tomorrow's Thanksgiving, so if they put him back in the pen, he'll be slaughtered. So they take him back to these little hideaway in the cave, and they come back, and they see that Frankenturkey is still not there. He still hasn't gotten home yet, which is an issue, because then Mr. and Mrs. Duggan see that Frankenturkey isn't there. And this is how that goes down. The backyard was bathed in moonlight, and frost made the grass crackle underfoot. Somewhere in the woods, an owl hooted forlornly. Kyle shivered, more from fear than from cold. He peered around the silent yard. Where was Frankenturkey? Was he waiting for them in the pen? Would Mr. Duggan's axe be a match for the monster's awesome power? "What the?" Mr. Duggan cried. Kyle froze. "The pen's empty!" his father shouted. "Our turkey's gone!" "Gone?" said Mrs. Duggan. "How can he be gone? The children put him back in his pen when they got home from school." Kyle's heart was racing as the family gathered around the empty pen. Annie squeezed his hand. "Look!" shouted Mr. Duggan. He was pointing to the opening Frankenturkey had ripped in the wire. "How could you children be so irresponsible? The pen is open! It's obvious that he got out and flew away. We'll never find him now." "And the stores are all closed," Mrs. Duggan added angrily. "It's too late to buy another turkey. In fact, all we have in the house is tuna fish. We'll have to eat tuna casserole for Thanksgiving dinner." A look of horror crossed her face. What would the pilgrims think? What would the pilgrims You know what, we're going to talk about this after the summary. So it's Thanksgiving Day, and even though they don't have a turkey or any of the stuff prepared, Mrs. Dugan insists on them wearing their pilgrim outfits because she is the worst, and both Kyle and Anne decide that they're going to go out and feed Gobbledygook. But as they head out to the cave, they hear something chasing them through the woods, and so they run quickly to get into his cave, and they get inside, only to realize that the thing that's chasing them is actually Jake. Apparently he wanted to have a second look at the turkey because he was convinced the one that came to school was different from the one that attacked him. It doesn't matter. What matters is that now that these three are here with their dog Trouble, now is when Frankenturkey reappears, and he is angry. And then his feet turn into knives for some reason, but he tries to attack the kids, and so they have to, run either side to get around him in the cave and try to run for freedom. But that's when Kyle realizes that Jake is still in the cave. See, after being attacked by Frankenturkey that time, he is terrified of the bird. He is frozen stiff. So Kyle decides that he's going to be the better man, so he runs back to save Jake. In fact, he calls out to Jake to run out of the cave. "Come on, I will help you get out of the cave," but he's too scared. So Kyle bucks up his courage, runs forward, and headbutts Frankenturkey to butt it out of the way. Then he grabs Jake by the hand, and he gets him out of the cave, and they run towards the house. At this point, Anne's already at safety, but Kyle and Jake need to get back to the house. But Jake has hurt his foot, so he can't really move properly. And Kyle has lost his direction. He's not used to these woods. And so Kyle has to walk the way whilst Jake leads the way, putting in the right direction as they finally get to the house, as Frankenturkey is chasing behind them. And they finally get to the house, and Jake says, "I've got an idea, open the garage." And then and then what happens is, you know what, I'm just going to read this from the book because this is insane. Annie disappeared inside the garage. The door swung wide open. This has got to work, Kyle thought desperately. If it doesn't, we're goners. Annie, Jake, both of you, get over in the corner and take Trouble with you, Kyle ordered the instant the boys were through the door. Bewildered, they did as they were told. But Kyle, Annie shouted as soon as she saw what he was going to do. There was no time to answer her. He raced toward the table under the garage window, just as Frankenturkey burst through the door. Ah! Screamed Frankenturkey as he spread his wings and lunged for Kyle. Kyle jumped off the table and rolled onto the floor, an instant before Frankenturkey landed on the exact spot where Kyle had just been. Frankenturkey looked around, confused. He shook his head and started to turn. Oh no, thought Kyle. It isn't working! At that instant, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky and crashed through the window. It shattered the glass and stabbed deep into the bird, lighting him up like a giant X-ray. Electricity danced along the wire coat hangers, sizzling and popping. Frankenturkey blinked on and off like a neon sign. Kyle covered his eyes to block out the dazzling brightness. Kyle! Kyle, look! Shrieked Annie. She was jerking on his arm and pointing at the table. Kyle opened his eyes, and his mouth dropped open in astonishment. The mask and coat hangers were gone. So were the blood-red head and the wart-covered beak, along with every last one of the singed feathers. Frankenturkey was gone, and in his place was a golden-brown turkey, cooked to perfection. So, that's the end. I want to start by saying that this was a lot of fun, this book. I mean, obviously, it's very dumb. But it was also dumb fun. Like, I'm going to critique this book, and I think there's a lot of things that you could fix with it, and some things that really do bug me. But honestly, it was a lot of fun. And sometimes that's all you really need to get a kid's book over the finishing line. Also, before we get into the critique proper, because this is a bit of a short summary, I actually have a bit of time, and there's something I want to talk about that this book implies, although not too directly, because this book takes place on Thanksgiving, at least the climax does. It's kind of slightly adjacent to the plot. It's related because of the whole turkey thing, but it brought to mind the fact that these horror books, often they don't settle for Simple Tuesday, to use the trope. Like, there are a few out there that play with different holidays. But I was looking through my Chapter Spook shelves, and I realized that there's actually not that much variety when it comes to the holidays. Obviously, there's Halloween, that's very common. But also there's Christmas, that's pretty common as well. And then not all that much more. I mean, I did find April Fool's Day, although I think that was mostly used for a pun. Graveyard School also has one for Easter. But beyond that, there's not really all that many different holidays, which I think is a little odd considering that when you look at horror for adults, I mean, there are so many. Literally, pick a holiday and there is a horror movie with a horror slasher set on that day. I suppose part of that is because different holidays mean different things. So I was actually surprised that there wasn't anything to do with Valentine's Day, but I guess that makes sense because that's about love, and I guess especially in the 90s they didn't want to encourage kids to have premarital sex, and so that was leading down a dark path. And then St. Patrick's Day, which is unfortunately associated with drinking, which doesn't really suit kids. I don't think that's actually what the holidays are about at all, but I guess because people have such a low view of Irish culture, they just associate it with, whiskey, let's get drunk. So I guess that's why they don't have many books set in St. Patrick's Day for kids. And so that's fair enough, but you know what surprised me? There's no Father's Day or Mother's Day holidays in children's horror fiction here. That surprised me, especially because this was set in the 90s. I mean, that was the prime time when it's all like, oh man, kids are cool and parents drool. Like, I'm surprised they didn't take that to a horror extreme and have the parents be the literal villains of the story. I mean, there are stories that do that, but it's usually more of like an invasive thing, like someone's taken over the parent. Although, that does get into sort of what I was thinking about when it comes to these different holidays and culture when it comes to horror. See, it's long been known that there is a bit of an interesting association between horror and comedy. Firstly, obviously, they both are visceral reactions. They're media that's all about either laughing because something's funny, or cringing or flinching because something's scary. These are bodily, emotional reactions. But more than that, they both seem to hold a similar place in culture when it comes to being an arbiter of morality. See, in looking into the history of horror, I was also looking into the history of clowns because they are these days associated with horror, but before the publication of Stephen King's It, people did find them quite funny and fun. And I was looking into the history of it to learn more about it, and I learned a lot when it comes to the idea of sacred clowning. And this is an idea that you can find in the New World with Native Americans, but especially in the Old World with England and also Europe when it comes to bards and jesters. See, these both held the same kind of role in society, and that was that they were there to be laughed at for questioning society, for questioning authority. So the jester was one of the few people in the entire court that was allowed to make fun of the king, to belittle him, because I don't know if you realize this, but royalty often has a whole mythology around the idea of the king being ordained by God. So the fact that someone was able to question that is deeply disrespectful. That's a whole off with their head. Like, that wasn't just a joke. Like, if you were speaking ill of the king, you were speaking ill of God. And yet there was this man whose job it was to make the king laugh by doing things that would be wrong in so many senses. But that was the entire point. The point of this jester and the sacred clown and the fool was to reinforce these societal norms by showing that when someone does the wrong thing, it is laughable. It is literally ridiculous, to be ridiculed. And by that same token, horror was used for morality tales. Before Disney and other censors changed the way that we look at modern fairy tales back in the day used to be incredibly dark, incredibly violent, incredibly scary for young kids, because the point was to scare kids into doing the right thing. The point was to say, look, this is what you must do. When you do the wrong thing, you could be taken by wolves, you could be stolen by strangers, you could lose all your money, you could be taken from your bed in the middle of the night by ogres. That was the whole point. And just as clowning continued on into the modern day with comedians who would reinforce societal norms by telling jokes about people who step outside of the norm, also horror, more often than not, would punish people for being immoral. I mean, a lot of people have pointed out that in a lot of slasher films, if you do drugs, you drink, you have sex, you're the first to die. And that's because societal norms at the time said that those people deserved what happened to them because they were sinning or being immoral in some way. But thankfully, when it comes to actually challenging social norms, both horror and comedy already have all the tools that they need. The same tools used to reinforce these norms can be used to challenge them. And a lot of horror seems to be doing that these days. We're getting a lot more focus on folk horror and racial horror and urban horror, which is actually questioning these things rather than reinforcing these old traditions and stereotypes. And I bring all this up because, yes, on the one hand, I do think it would be interesting for children's horror to explore different holidays because it would give us a chance to learn more about different cultures and all kinds of cultures out there. But more importantly, as I've just discussed, it has the tools necessary to question these things. As I said, this whole Thanksgiving thing makes me feel uncomfortable because it's basically celebrating colonization. It's the same issue I have with Australia Day. There are a lot of issues with a lot of holidays and a lot of traditions. Like if we go back to the Mother's Day and Father's Day example, in my own personal experience, in this day and age, I've seen men who were celebrated on Mother's Day because they're single fathers. And I've seen women celebrated on Father's Day because they are lesbian, and so that's effectively their father. It's questioning these heteronormative cultural norms. Or hell, not everyone is lucky enough to have a good parent. Not only single parents, but I know a whole lot of unfortunate people who have had abusive upbringings, traumatic upbringings because of things that their parents have done to them. So a day like Mother's or Father's Day that celebrates someone who was meant to be your caregiver is traumatizing for people like that. So this is what I'm saying. There is so much opportunity to explore different stories, different ideas, different cultural norms, challenging cultural norms, all of this stuff. And yet we just have yet another story with an evil Santa Claus. Yeah, I guess. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy these things. That's what I'm saying. I want more, but I want different. Heck, even a Frankenturkey is a bit of a unique idea. I mean, I have seen there's a few horror movies that do this. I think Blood Freak and Thanksgiving do have a killer turkey. But this is the first time it's been done in kids' horror, and that should be celebrated. Different ideas. Even this, think about this. When there's an evil Santa Claus, why does he always seem to have an axe? I don't know what that is. I've noticed it so often. Is it because he looks like a dwarf? I don't quite get it. Maybe it's because him holding a gun is weird. I don't know. My point is, even these tropes which were meant to be challenging cultural expectations, because this is Christmas, it's meant to be a time of joy, and we're using it for horror and blood and guts, and even these have started to become prosaic and repetitive. why not do something new? Why not have a story that's set on the Day of the Dead, but preferably written by someone who knows something about it? But that's what I'm saying. Like, this also gives an opportunity for people to explore their culture. So, there is a series that I don't actually have on my Chapter Spook shelf, but I really want it. It's my white whale, and that is Mr. Midnight. For those of you who don't know, that's a Singaporean series of children's horror books, each with 2 stories in them, and it's written by an Australian author using a pseudonym. I was looking them up on their website to find out how much it would cost, and fun fact, it's about $1,000 to get every single one shipped and delivered to my house, so I have some saving up to do for that. But I was looking at their special editions, because the first 6 or so were Halloween and Christmas, because they were based on holidays, their special editions. However, after about 6 special editions hopping back and forth between Christmas and Halloween, they introduced the Lunar New Year special editions, because that holiday is just as important, if not more important, than Halloween or Christmas for them. And that's a brilliant idea, because those are written for Singaporean children, so they can learn more about their own culture, but it also means that if someone else finds those books, someone like me, and I do want to read those books at some point, it means that I get to learn more about a holiday I don't know about. And I still don't know anything about Thanksgiving from this book, ostensibly about Thanksgiving, because it didn't bother. Maybe because it expected everyone else to know what it was already, or maybe they just didn't know. After all, what would the pilgrims think? Anyway, I should get back to the actual critique, but I'm afraid on that note, I have to start by saying, so when it comes to this book proper, I do hate Mrs. Dugan so much. Oh my god. First of all, they've moved from Florida to Massachusetts. Very different atmosphere, very different time. And so her way of trying to ingratiate her child with the class is to insist on him dressing up as something he does not want to dress as. And then they're insisting on buying a turkey and killing it, which, again, nothing like Florida. I don't know why you think that's a good replacement to replace... They literally say jet skis and sunshine with murdering an animal to pluck it and cook it yourself. And what would the pilgrims think? Woman, they were fleeing from what they saw as state-sanctioned religious vilification. It wasn't anything to do with the turkey. That was just what they had available. If they had the ability to eat tuna casserole, they would be thankful, because it means that it's a meal that they wouldn't have to fight to eat just to survive. You are a teacher. You should know better. Arguably, you could say that that's good writing, because Kyle doesn't like his mum because she's part of what's making his life so miserable, but that is just a step too far. But speaking of Kyle, I kind of like that he has this sort of imaginative streak that he keeps going off on these tangents of like, oh, maybe this is happening, maybe that's happening. I don't like how much of the plot is predicated on that. There's at least 3 occasions where they go out of their way to check something because he's scared that someone has attacked something without him seeing, or that something's been lost without him seeing, and that does bug me a little bit. But I do like some of his characterization. Like, I actually like the fact that he is being bullied, but he feels like he can't tell his parents, because that's very relatable. A lot of people feel like that. They're wrong, but that's the thing. Characters can be wrong in books so long as you can understand them. I've said that before, and it's true. He says that if he were to tell his parents, he's worried that that'll just mean that they'll have to tell Jake's parents, and then as soon as Jake knows, he'll beat him up even more. Now, obviously, I still think that's a good step towards solving the issue, but you can see where he's coming from. You can see how he's thinking, right? In fact, it's the emotional logic that actually drives this story forward. Like, does it make a lot of sense that a turkey would be a really great pet that can follow you around without a leash, that would enjoy being hugged? I mean, I don't think so. That's not really how turkeys work. They're kind of conflating that with a dog, but it makes emotional sense. This is something that he cares for. This is something that he wants to protect, and so he decides to save it from his father's axe. That makes emotional sense, even if it doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense. Just as to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense that some kids would become your friends after you bring a turkey to school and say that it scared the school bully. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but it does make emotional sense. I think that's where this story really resonates, and it's probably the reason why it's so much fun, is that it feels like it's logical, even though it definitely doesn't think like it's logical. And speaking of which, someone needs to explain to me why they brought a turkey to school. Because, as I sort of intimated, they basically walk the turkey around and the kids pet it. Now, after reading the story, it makes sense to most people why they pet the turkey. It's because this is Gobbledygook, and he's a really kind little turkey. He's really friendly. He likes being petted. But most turkeys don't like that. Most turkeys are actually quite aggressive. If you hold up a mirror to a turkey, it will peck at it, not because it's trying to see the other turkey, but because that's how pecking order works. If they see another turkey that they don't recognize, they will attack it so that they can gain dominance. They are very social creatures. They have a social hierarchy. Like I said, they're not stupid creatures. They may not think like you and I, but that's how they interact with one another. They can be quite aggressive. So the idea of bringing a turkey into the middle of the school, not to mention, like, where is this thing crapping? Like, it's there all day. They say it's there from like 9 to 5 until they get home. They leave it in the teacher's lounge in the meantime. Are they cleaning up after this thing? And the closest we get to learning anything about the turkey is some kids are like, well, what do you feed it? He's like, well, we feed it corn. Wow, what an amazing lesson for the kids. We feed birds bird feed. And I do admit this is also partly why I hate Mrs. Duggan so much, because she insisted on bringing this turkey to school. This is a teachable moment. Use it to explain why do we eat turkeys at Thanksgiving. Because seriously, the only thing I've learned about Thanksgiving from this book is that it happened in Massachusetts. They don't even say where in Massachusetts. I only know that it's in Plymouth because I looked up what the Pilgrims were like because I wanted to answer that stupid question of what they would have thought. And I just want to end talking about the magic lightning thing, because it does bother me, because it is both a Diabula ex machina and Deus ex machina. The author imposing their will on the story, that is a Deus ex machina. Then God comes out of the machine to change the story, either for the better as Deus Ex, or for the worse as Diabula Ex. And that's what magic lightning is doing here. It brings Frankenturkey to life, and it turns it into a Thanksgiving dinner, because of course it does. On the one hand, I think you could make something like that work if the story wasn't about Frankenturkey, if you know what I'm saying. So if it was more about how you deal with Frankenturkey. Like something like Groundhog Day comes to mind. So where Groundhog Day comes from doesn't matter. What matters is that it's about how you deal with this new paradigm. And I think that could have worked for a story like this, because it doesn't matter where Frankenturkey comes from, it matters how you deal with it. But this story doesn't really seem to have like much meaning or moral. Like at the very last second, there's this whole thing about how Kyle decides to help Jake despite being a bully, and he actually says to him about Frankenturkey, oh, well, he's going after you because you look scared, because that's what bullies do, like hinting at the last moment that maybe this had something to do with bullies. The story has nothing to do with bullying. Like, I get that it's nice to forgive someone if they've been hurting you, but hold on, no. This has nothing to do with, like, forgiving. I mean, the book's about Thanksgiving. Are they trying to say that we should forgive the stuff with that's kind, you know what, it's a bold choice for a white person to say that we should forgive white people for what they did. So you know what, I'm going to choose to say no, that's not what the book's about. So you know what, this has nothing to do with bullying, because it sure as hell better not have anything to do with that. It didn't. This is the first time anything like that's come up about how learning how bullies think. But they tried, I suppose. But my point is, I wouldn't have minded the Frankenturkey coming from out of the machine and going back into the machine if the story was about how that made them change as characters, how it caused you to learn because of what happened. But that's not really what this story was about. I think what this story was about is that someone came up with the title Frankenturkey, which, again, no notes, solid title. But I think someone came up with that title and then tried to retrofit a kid's story onto it and struggled a lot, especially with the fact that Frankenstein would have meant playing with dead things. And so I think that's where the whole rubber mask coat hanger thing came in, because that's the only way to do this without getting into the literal blood and guts of grave robbing. Or I guess turkey slaughter, you know what I mean. For that reason, I have to give this story a C+. That's a passing mark, but I have to mark it down because the plot elements don't make a lot of sense. The fact that this kid decides to make the bogus bird in the first place doesn't make a lot of sense when you even think for a second about what will happen when his parents look at it. I don't get it. The only way the plot would have made sense is if he knew that by doing this it would turn it into a living bird that looked like Gobbledygook. But that makes no sense because it involves magic lightning, so honestly, you probably could have tweaked that a little bit, but as it stands, no, it's only just a passing grade. And the only reason it passes as well as it does is because of, like I said, that emotional intelligence, that emotional logic that drags the story through. And also, you may have got a little hint of it through some of those book excerpts, but some of the writing here is really good. I liked some of the descriptive language used to describe walking through the woods or looking into the darkness, things like that. It was very well written in that sense, even though it wasn't very well plotted in another sense. So from this story, I have two bits of advice for writers, and the first bit to me is absolutely obvious. Have fun. Make sure that you're enjoying what you're writing. It's clear to me that I was having this much fun because Betsy was having fun coming up with these silly ideas of what they were doing with the Frankenturkey. Like, it doesn't make any sense, like, that its warts were, like, dripping and that its coat hanger veins were pulsing, but it was incredibly fun to read, and so don't be afraid to put that fun in there because it makes it so much more enjoyable to read if it was that much fun to write, even if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And hey, I know Betsy must have been having fun because there is a Frankenturkey 2 on the horizon, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. But the second thing I think has to be, don't be afraid to play around with those tropes, even those ones that you think are bad, because like, I think the Deus Ex Machina thing, that's usually considered just bad writing, because generally speaking, it is bad writing if it's used to solve the plot from nowhere. But I say, don't be afraid to look into those. Explore what you can do with them outside of their issues, because so long as you can write a story with Deus Ex Machina, resolving some plot thread without fixing the character arc, I think you could still have a good story there. I don't think that's coming directly from the story, but that's what I'm sort of learning here, is that they play around with a lot of silly tropes in this story, and I think that you could play around with them yourself so long as you put in the effort to make sure you're doing it properly. And hey, as always, if you thought that was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.